Welcome back to the channel. In this video, what I want to cover is how I made this epoxy and cherry wood bowl. I think it's pretty darn neat, to be honest with you. And I released several shorts and Instagram reels and stuff on this, and people seemed very interested in how I did it. And so I want to go through that in this video. I'm actually going to make a couple videos because otherwise the videos start to get too long, and as you look at them and you watch them for a while, sometimes if they get too long, I find people getting brain damage, and the brain damage comes from their head hitting the desk as they fall asleep. Haha, I hope that was funny. Anyway, the bottom line is that I want you to be able to make this bowl yourself if you want to. I've discovered several things when making the bowl that I didn't really understand very well, and therefore I thought I would share my experiences with you so that if you decide to take on this project or another similar project of two-sided bowl of some sort, that you would understand those same things that I came to understand. To build this project specifically will require you to go purchase a file from Corbin Dunn off his website, because this is actually his design and he does everything in Fusion 360. I don't use Fusion except for my 3D printing, so using Fusion 360 the way he did was not something I wanted to go down. I use Vectric software. I use both vCarve Pro and Aspire, and because more people have vCarve, I wanted to do this project in vCarve Pro. Doing it in vCarve requires me to actually have two different files made, and we do it in two different steps. So I wanted to go ahead and break up the series in those two steps, and that's what you'll see here, but I'll release both steps at the same time. The first step will be to go through how to build what he calls the dripstock. The dripstock is a block of cherry wood that you carve a pattern in. In this case, it's a heart because of the heart bowl. And then you pour epoxy into it and let that harden. When everything's said and done, you get this very interesting, what I'll call drip pattern or random pattern around the lip, which looks really cool in my opinion. And that was all developed by Corbin, and he's got videos on how he went about developing this drip stock or this drip pattern that are well worth watching. And the videos for his developing that drip pattern and this bowl itself, I'll actually link in the video description down below this video. Even if you decide not to buy Corbin's STL, this video, especially the second one, will walk you through how, if you had your own STL of a two-sided model, especially a bowl or a dish, you can set that up to carve in vCarve Pro or Aspire. I think the bowl turned out beautiful. I'm really happy with it, and I'm really glad that Corbin had these files available. The first step is to create a new file for the bowl that we're going to make, and we are going to need to actually create two files, one that's two-sided and one that's one-sided. And the reason we need to create two files in vCarve Pro, we would not need to do that in Aspire, is because in vCarve Pro you can only have one open imported STL at a time, and we're going to be working with STL files. So the first one we're going to do would be the dripstock bowl, which is where we will pour the epoxy into and let it harden and then carve the bowl out of the combined epoxy and cherry bowl when it's hardened. With that, then we'll go ahead and create a new file. And since I've created one before, you can see it's already has the width, length, and the thickness of the material, as I've been trying to make sure that I can go through this process as smoothly as possible. I'm going to keep it in the center at the moment, but before I actually carve this, I will go ahead and put it on the left corner. Standard fastest modeling resolution, I'm not worried about that very much. For the dripstock, when I get to the bowl, I'll up it to the very high. Well, in fact, I'll just go ahead and do it now. Material, we want cherry. That's already in there. Hit OK. And now we have our block of material that we will want to use. If we look at the 3D view, it simply looks like a block of material. Now we're going to import the component that we want to use, which is the STL that we get from Corbin when we purchase the file. So we'll come over here to import a component or 3D model, and we're going to go, the first one we're going to do is the Dripstock. We're going to open that up. And we want to change this from millimeters to inches because the file we get from Corbin is in millimeters. We don't want to change anything else. Everything looks good. We're going to position and import this. Oh, let me go back. I do want to make sure it's centered. There we go. It was not coming in centered, so we wanted to make sure of that. And now I'm going to position and import the model. And the model says it's 1.25 inches below the top. I'm looking at the model and everything looks good. It doesn't have any gray areas from what I'll call the zero plane or limit plane, modeling plane, whatever you want to call it. Let me show you how it comes in sometimes. So if you move it up, you see how you have this shaded area. That means that is now below the modeling plane or zero plane, so it's not going to carve. And so we need to go ahead and move this down in the model so that it's appearing all blue. We don't want any gray. And now we've got that all settled in. Let's just take a look from the side what it looks like. And you can see the block of wood is basically at the top. And so we don't need to create both sides because we are above that. We don't need data below the zero plane right here because we've already brought everything above the plane. So we're going to go ahead and import the model now. Now that we have the model imported, it's time to go ahead and set it up for toolpaths and carving. So the first thing we want to do is let's take open the 2D view, is we want to make some vectors for setting up our toolpaths. So I'm going to click here on the model. I'm going to go to the bitmap trace tool. I'm going to move the threshold up so that it turns out to be like one full color. I don't have a bunch of separate white spaces and stuff in here. You saw that. Then I'll go ahead and preview, and you can see we get some nice solid vectors there. I'm going to apply those, and I'm going to call those, move those. I'm going to actually, they're on layer 1 right now. So I'm going to rename layer 1 as model vectors. And then I'm going to create a new vector that I'm going to call tool vector. And the tool vectors are the ones that I'm going to use to set up my carving later on. I'll put those blue. There's nothing there. We're going to leave that active, tool vectors. Now I'm going to take and I'm going to ungroup onto the original object layers, which is level 1. All right, they moved on me. That's what I wanted to check. So I need to take these and go back now and move that to model vectors. Trying to keep this straight. And so now I want to take this vector and I want to offset that vector out 0.12 inches, just about the size of my finishing bit. I went in the wrong direction. You see I went inwards. I wanted to go outwards. There we are. Now I'll take this vector and I'll do the same thing but inwards. Close. Now I'm trying to be very conscious of the space around the vectors because I'm going to want to leave the carving such that it doesn't encroach on the walls of this cherry block. because they need to hold the epoxy in place when I pour it. So now I have those vectors in place. Let's go to the double view here. So the next step in is to set up the tool paths for this. So the first tool path I need to set up is the roughing tool path. And as I set up the roughing tool path, let me check one thing first. I want to see where the model is relative to the material. And you can see the model came in down at the bottom, taking away anything out of the bottom, which means it's going to carve really deep into the block. That's not what I want. I'm going to come to the top, and even though I made this block flat, I have a general habit of just putting my material about 0.2 below. Probably not necessary, but it's helpful in this case because I'm going to pour epoxy in here, and if it's slightly below, then I can over pour the epoxy without worrying about it running all over the block. You'll see what I mean when we pour this. So now that we're set there, we're going to put 0.02. Hit OK. Now we'll create our roughing tool path. I'm going to use a ball nose that's 3/8 inch in diameter. And so I'm going to go in here. So now I've got the ball nose selected. And I'm going to go to the selected vectors. So I'm going to select this vector and this vector. Or if I wanted, I could come over here and I could hit closed vectors, and I could hit model vector, and I could hit associate with toolpath, close. Now that's not what I wanted. You see I selected the wrong one. I selected model vectors. I should have selected tool vectors, close, hit calculator. That did some weird stuff. I'm working on my Mac, and sometimes it dogs down a little bit and does weird stuff. So we've got everything calculated. And the next step then is to go ahead and preview the path. Let me go ahead and open this up wider so we have a good view of it. We'll go to the top and we'll hit preview visible. Now something isn't looking right to me right now. I don't remember coming way up on top here. So let me go check my toolpath again and see what I missed. Okay, so we're going to go in and check what I missed on the toolpath. And I've got a boundary offset here. I don't need that. I already built in enough boundary offset with the vectors that I put on the outside there. 3D raster 90, so that's better. So now we're going to calculate that again. So that's a lesson in always watching what you're expecting, and when it went further out than I expected, I knew that was an issue. Now you might ask why I went with the raster strategy instead of the Z-level strategy, because if I went with the Z-level strategy, it's only going to go down to wherever the end mill can go without cutting off the rest of these rises. And I want to have as little work left over for my finishing bit. So I want to go ahead and be able to get down into the dips and crannies for this drip bowl when I'm said and done. And so the best way to do that was, one, to use a ball nose, and then go ahead and have that be able to get down in like these nooks and crannies where the end mill would not have been able to do that. So that's why I picked a ball nose to do my roughing cut. So instead of having flat areas, we see a nice shape here, which means there will be less work to do for my finishing bit, which will be a 1/8 inch tapered ball nose. Now, if we hover over that tool path, you can see down here on the right that its expected depth is to go to about 1.0635 inches, and the estimated time for the tool path to run is about 15 minutes, give or take. My tool paths on my machine are actually usually faster than these estimated ones. So now we're going to go ahead and go with the finishing pass and get that set up. And the finishing pass, we're going to use a tapered ball nose, 1/8 inch. I've already selected it before. We don't need to go through that. We're going to go to the selected vectors like we did before. We have 0 boundary offset because we're going out to this, basically a boundary offset that I put in with these vectors. We are going to use an offset path, which means it's going to go around and around the bowl. And we're going to calculate that. And that's what that's going to look like. So we preview visible toolpath. And there we go. That's what it looks like. You'll see the little indent of 0.02 inches. If we hover over here, you'll see we're at 2.5 inches. And then if I come over to this direction, you'll see it goes to 2.48. I'm looking down lower right corner there, and that's that 0.02 from the top of the block that we set the model at. That will help with the epoxy pour. This will act kind of like a lip to stop it from running out over the rest of the block. So I'm happy with that. Now the next thing I need to do, hit close here, and I need to set it so that this will carve from the bottom left corner. Remember, I was setting up everything up for the center because I wanted it to be centered, and it is. So now we're going to come over here, and everything's done. We got 0.02. We're still off the machine bed. Hit OK. Material setup values change. Hit yes. We want to recalculate everything. Hit OK. And now that we've got the toolpaths all set up and ready to go, we can go out to the machine and carve it. Let me change the name on these toolpaths first before we go out there. So we're all ready to go out and carve the material. So if you've made it through the software portion of this video, we're now going to head into the actual carving of the Dripstock. And if you like what you're doing, this will be just a little gentle reminder. Please give me that thumbs up, give me a comment, share the video, and if you want to see more of this kind of material, subscribe to it so that the channel can grow and that you will be aware of future videos. Every like, comment, subscribe, share helps the channel, helps YouTube decide to put my video out to others. With that, let's go ahead and get into the actual cutting of the wood. As you can see, I start this process by taking several pieces of cherry. You can see all the pile in the back there that I've milled up a bunch of lumber. And I'm taking a couple chunks of cherry and I'm gluing those together so I have a thick enough block to be able to carve with. I needed it to be about 2.5 inches thick to fit my model, so that's what I'm doing there. Let it sit overnight, yank off all the clamps, and then once you've got it all glued together, of course you got to prep the block. Get a little assistance when it gets stuck with that little stick you see there, and then I measure with the calipers, and when it's all said and done, I have a block that meets the perfect specs that I needed to, 2.5 inches thick, 9.5 inches wide, 9.5 inches long. What you see here is a block of cherry, and it's held into the CNC or onto the CNC with these side clamps on the side and one on the front that you can't see. I've also got spacer bars on the front of the fence and on the side of the fence, and you'll see later when I turn this thing over why I did that. I needed to have room to flip it and put it on the dowels, and it never aligns perfectly right against the fence, so I needed some ability to move it slightly on the turnover. Then the next thing you see here is this is my 3/8 inch ball nose that I've set up, and I'll be using that for the roughing pass, and then from there we'll go ahead with this 1/8 inch tapered ball nose. Both of those you would have seen in the software part of this video earlier on. We'll go from here. So now it's time to go ahead and start carving the rough cut of the Dripstock. And we're using that big 3/8 inch ball nose, and I just left the dust cover on there because I just didn't want to deal with the mess. But it really throws some stuff, and you can see how the 3/8 inch ball nose is going ahead and putting the dimples in there, and it's leaving about 0.04 inches machining tolerance based on what we programmed into the software. And in some cases, it might be a little thicker. And if I'd have done the Z pattern, it would have just been that flat area that we saw. And this is what it looks like when we're done with the rough stock. Now I'm doing the finish cut with the 1/8 inch tapered ball nose and a raster pattern. And as we're all said and done, you can see it did a really interesting job and a good job, and it's nice and clean. All right, I finished carving what we call the dripstock of the bowl. Now this bowl has all this sporadic pattern in here, and I'm going to fill this up with epoxy. And then once the epoxy hardens in a few days, I'll come back and then I'll take this same piece and I'll carve out the bowl, and it will end up with that epoxy rim spots that you saw in the other picture, or that I'll show you in the next pictures. Okay, got this carved up. This is the drip where the epoxy is going to go in. It'll be the rim of the bowl, so that's the next step, is to go ahead and take this, set it up so that I can pour the epoxy in it. I want 15 ounces total. I start to mix up the epoxy, the 15 ounces that I need. I make sure it gets stirred real well. As I'm showing in the notes, I'm using ultra clear epoxy, and I'm using eye candy pigment, Persian purple. Turns out pretty cool. You'll notice I'm making sure everything is level, and as I pour this, I'm pouring it on something covered with some Tyvek tape and making sure that any spills I can get easily cleaned up, and then I get to do the cool bubble popping that comes with an epoxy project. Then I'll top it off a little bit more and we'll be set to go. Well, that wraps up the first video on how to make the dripstock and get ready for the next video, which is the carving of the bowl. Well, this dripstock was pretty straightforward. Dripstock is Corbin's name, and it has to do with dripping the epoxy in there and the shape of the drips in there. So we're now done with the dripstock. We're going to go right into the two-sided bowl. And to me, it is actually the more complicated of the two files to set up, especially when it comes into playing with the overcut distance and the limit planes, and then making sure that all the tool paths are set up so they cut the way you want them to, and we don't end up with broken bits or other things happening. With that, we're going to go into that video.